Nathan McRae had never been the kind of man who sought out conflict, and moving into this quiet cul-de-sac on the edge of town was meant to be his final escape from the relentless pace of urban life. At 52, he wasn't looking for reinvention, just silence. A place where he could read in the mornings, work from his small solar installation business during the day, and tend to the modest garden that wrapped around the front of his newly purchased home. He'd done his due diligence before buying: clean titles, stable neighborhood, no overt trouble. It had charm, a strong sense of order, and most importantly, no obvious drama. Until Karen Brooks rolled into his life, quite literally, on a decked-out golf cart that seemed far too large for her thick frame and short temper. From the beginning, there was something off about her presence. She wasn't the usual overbearing neighbor that you could politely nod to and avoid. Karen exuded a territorial energy, like she had staked some ancestral claim over the entire street. The way she spoke about the neighborhood at the first meet and greet, "My street, my sidewalk, my rules," was more than awkward small talk. It was a declaration. She acted as though she had authority no one else had voted on, and to Nathan's surprise, people either ignored her or acted vaguely afraid. The real surprise came 3 days after his move-in, when he found a laminated neighborhood courtesy notice tucked under his windshield wiper. It wasn't signed, but the typewriter font and passive-aggressive tone: "Please consider repainting your mailbox to match the community palette. Thank you for respecting tradition," reeked of Karen. Nathan wasn't one for overreacting, so he made no fuss. He didn't repaint the mailbox either, but things escalated. Karen began driving past his property more and more often, circling at least twice a day on her cart like she was patrolling. Her vehicle was absurd. Custom wheels, fog lights, even a tiny bullhorn mounted to the front. And she maneuvered it like she was born behind the wheel of a tank. Once, she passed so close to Nathan while he was watering his hedges that the spray from the hose bounced off her windshield. She stopped, stared at him for a second too long, then drove off without a word. Still, Nathan said nothing. In his mind, this was a woman who thrived on being acknowledged, on being resisted. He figured if he didn't give her oxygen, she'd eventually turn her attention elsewhere. He was wrong. It was a cloudless Sunday afternoon when the first real trouble started. Nathan had just finished loading his trunk with groceries, planning to spend the rest of the day tinkering in his garden, when he noticed Karen's massive golf cart idling near the entrance of the cul-de-sac. Her arms, thick and pale under a straining floral blouse, were crossed firmly over her chest as she watched him. Nathan didn't react. He adjusted the last bag in the back seat, got into his car, and began the slow drive toward his house. The sun hung high and heavy, and the narrow street shimmered slightly in the heat, creating a warped, almost surreal atmosphere. He didn't see Karen move immediately. 1 second she was standing there, and the next she was barreling toward him, her golf cart squealing as its tiny tires bit into the pavement. Nathan's instincts flared. She wasn't just crossing in front of him to make a point. She was aiming straight for the driver's side of his vehicle, a stubborn expression carved into her fleshy face. He tapped his brakes, swerving sharply to the right, the corner of his bumper brushing against a row of neatly trimmed hedges. The impact never came. Karen missed him by inches, jerking her cart at the last second and rumbling off without even a glance back. Nathan sat frozen for a beat, knuckles white around the steering wheel, heart hammering against his ribs. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It wasn't a mistake. She had tried to run him off the road. For the first time since moving in, Nathan felt a genuine pulse of fear, quickly buried under a rising tide of anger. This wasn't a petty nuisance anymore. It was a deliberate, dangerous escalation. He pulled carefully into his driveway, checking his mirrors to make sure Karen hadn't doubled back, then got out and walked around the car. The hedges had left faint scratches along the passenger side, shallow but visible. He crouched, inspecting the marks, feeling the low simmer of rage harden into something more useful. Focus. Nathan didn't storm over to Karen's house. He didn't shout, threaten, or confront. Instead, he went inside, poured himself a glass of water with hands steadier than he expected, and sat at his kitchen table. His mind was already working methodically. He had a Dashcam mounted in his car, an investment he'd made after a minor fender bender the year before. It wasn't some fancy model, but it recorded continuously and backed up the last hour to a hidden memory card. Without rushing, he retrieved it, plugged it into his laptop, and scanned through the footage. There it was. clear as day. The image was unmistakable. Karen's bloated figure, her golf cart barreling from the shoulder into the street with reckless precision, aiming not to cross but to collide. Nathan watched it 3 times, feeling a strange mixture of vindication and dread. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was a vehicular assault, even if it was with a golf cart. He knew enough about liability to realize that if he let this go, the next time it might be worse, and next time he might not have a chance to dodge. By evening, Nathan was sitting across from Officer Ruiz at the small police substation located near the town center. Ruiz was a tall man in his 40s, sharp-eyed and even sharper-tongued, but Nathan respected him immediately for his no-nonsense demeanor. He explained everything in straightforward, calm language, without dramatics or assumptions. He presented the dashcam footage, the scratches on his car, and a printed map of the street showing the tight dimensions of the road. Ruiz reviewed the video silently, occasionally pausing and rewinding certain frames. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and rubbed his jaw thoughtfully. "She tried to hit you, no doubt about it," Ruiz said finally, tapping a knuckle against the desk. "Question is whether it was intentional or reckless endangerment. Either way, you did the right thing coming straight here." Nathan nodded, feeling a small knot in his chest loosen. Ruiz continued, "We'll file a formal report. You'll probably be contacted for a statement. It won't be instant, but this isn't going to get swept under the rug." Nathan thanked him and headed home under the deepening twilight, his car moving cautiously along the empty streets. But even as he pulled into his driveway and killed the engine, he couldn't shake the sense that he had crossed some invisible line today. Until now, Karen had been a bully, a loudmouth, a nuisance. But something in her eyes during that charge, an unhinged, almost gleeful glint, told him this wasn't over. She wouldn't back down just because the law got involved. If anything, it would only provoke her further. Inside, Nathan sat down at his kitchen table again and began documenting everything. Times, dates, interactions, no matter how minor. He saved backup copies of the footage on 2 separate drives. One he hid in the shed behind his house, the other he kept in a fireproof safe. He drafted a letter to his insurance company, notifying them of potential vandalism risks without accusing anyone directly, just enough to have a record on file. By the time the moon rose high and pale over the neat rooftops of the neighborhood, Nathan had everything logged and secured. He turned off the lights and sat in the dark living room for a long while, looking out the window toward the street where Karen's house sat in darkness. Somewhere beyond those trimmed hedges and carefully maintained lawns, a storm was gathering, one that couldn't be avoided with politeness or passivity. Nathan knew one thing for certain: whatever came next, he would meet it prepared. 3 days passed without direct confrontation, but Nathan could feel the pressure tightening around him like a noose. Karen had gone quiet. Not the kind of quiet that suggested surrender, but the simmering, calculated silence of someone plotting their next move. He noticed subtle changes first. The way her golf cart would appear at the end of his street, just as he pulled into his driveway, sitting idle under the shade of an oak tree with her hulking frame barely visible behind the wheel. The sudden appearance of dead plants left abandoned in ceramic pots near his mailbox, as if daring him to move them and provoke a new confrontation. And the way certain neighbors, those he had exchanged polite nods with in the beginning, now avoided meeting his eyes altogether. It wasn't the actions themselves that unsettled him. It was the careful passive aggression stitched into them, the unspoken challenge hanging heavy in the air. Karen wasn't attacking openly. She was laying the groundwork, twisting the social fabric of the street, trying to isolate him. Nathan kept his head down and continued to act methodically. He installed a new exterior camera above his garage. Not a cheap one either, but a model with high-definition recording and night vision. He placed a small, unobtrusive sign on his lawn. Premises monitored for safety. It wasn't a threat. It was a warning to anyone who thought his house was an easy target. That simple step seemed to irritate Karen almost immediately. That afternoon, while Nathan trimmed the hedges lining his walkway, she drove past slowly, golf cart humming low, her face twisting into a sneer as she took in the new installation. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. Her scowl said it all. The real escalation came the following Sunday. Nathan had just returned from the hardware store, the bed of his pickup stacked with lumber for a new privacy fence he was building along the side of his property. As he carefully backed into his driveway, a figure burst into his peripheral vision. Karen's son, A massive man, somewhere in his 30s with a thick neck and broad shoulders, was standing on the sidewalk, arms folded across his barrel chest, staring him down. Nathan put the truck in park and stepped out slowly, keeping a cautious eye on him. "You Nathan McRae?" the man barked, his voice low and heavy. Nathan didn't bother responding. He simply stared back, calm but unyielding. The man took a step closer, closing the distance. "You got my mom all twisted up," he said, jabbing a thick finger toward Nathan's chest, not quite making contact but close enough to ignite a visceral reaction. "She ain't done nothing to you, man. You need to back off, stop harassing her, or else things are going to get real uncomfortable for you around here." Nathan exhaled slowly through his nose, letting the silence stretch out until the man shifted uncomfortably. Then he spoke, low and even. "You're trespassing. Turn around and leave." His voice wasn't loud, but it was steady, the kind of voice that didn't invite argument. The man hesitated, searching Nathan's face for any sign of fear or weakness, but finding none. After a long beat, he spat onto the curb, muttered something under his breath, and stomped away down the sidewalk. Nathan didn't move until he was completely out of sight. Only then did he reach into his pocket where his phone had been recording audio the entire time. He filed the clip away immediately. It was insurance, just like everything else. That evening, Nathan filed a supplemental report with Officer Ruiz, citing the confrontation with Karen's son. He didn't embellish, didn't speculate, just the facts, supported by the audio recording. Ruiz promised to attach it to the ongoing investigation and suggested quietly but firmly that Nathan might want to avoid direct interaction with Karen and her family as much as possible until the legal process played out. Nathan agreed. He had no desire to let emotion drive him into a mistake. 2 mornings later, Nathan found his garbage cans overturned in the street, trash scattered like confetti over the pavement. His recycling bin was missing entirely. It wasn't the work of raccoons or wind. The clean, deliberate mess spoke of human hands. Once again, Nathan documented everything. Photographs from multiple angles, a time-stamped log of when he had last seen the bins intact, and a written note describing the incident. He didn't accuse anyone directly in his report to the city's Waste Services Department. He simply made sure there was a paper trail. This time, however, he took another step. He requested a public records search on any complaints filed by Karen Brooks in the past year. It wasn't hard to do. Local ordinances made such records available to residents for a small fee. When the results came back, they were illuminating. Karen had filed more than a dozen official complaints against various neighbors. Everything from unauthorized paint colors to improper placement of garden ornaments. She wasn't a crusader for order. She was a serial harasser using bureaucracy as her weapon. Nathan printed the records and filed them with the rest of his growing collection of evidence. The days dragged by under a heavy electric tension. Every small noise made Nathan's muscles coil in readiness. Every parked golf cart, every creaking floorboard next door, every sudden bark of a neighbor's dog felt like a potential trigger. Despite this, he forced himself to stick to his routine. He worked, he ran his business, he maintained his property. He refused to let Karen's games derail his life. And yet, the stress was cumulative. It was in the tightening of his jaw when he spotted Karen glowering at him from her front porch. It was in the slight tremor in his hand when he turned his house key in the lock at night. It was in the way he now checked over his shoulder when walking to retrieve his mail. The final straw in this stage of escalation came not with shouting or another reckless attack, but with a letter. It arrived by certified mail addressed to Nathan personally. Inside was a neatly typed cease and desist notice from a law firm Nathan didn't recognize, claiming that he had been harassing and intimidating Karen Brooks and demanding that he cease all unwarranted surveillance activities. It was a laughable document full of vague accusations and threats of civil action. Nathan scanned it carefully, noting the absence of specific dates, times, or incidents. It was all bluster, a scare tactic designed to intimidate him into dropping his complaint and retreating. He responded the way he always did, calmly, methodically, legally. He contacted his own attorney, a quiet, sharp woman named Julia Black, and forwarded her the letter along with the dashcam footage, the photos, the audio recording, and the complaint history he had gathered. Julia reviewed everything and got back to him the next day with a crisp assessment. "You're not the one who should be worried here. That night, Nathan sat on his porch with a cup of black coffee, staring out into the humid darkness. Across the street, Karen's house was a hive of restless energy, lights flicking on and off, shadows moving behind the curtains. Nathan watched without emotion, feeling the solid weight of the evidence he had built pressing against his chest like armor. He wasn't on the defensive anymore. Now he was simply waiting. It was only a matter of time before Karen's desperation pushed her into making a mistake she couldn't undo. And when that moment came, Nathan would be ready. The heat had thickened over the neighborhood by the time everything finally cracked open. Nathan noticed the shift early that morning when he stepped outside to retrieve his mail and caught sight of a folded piece of paper tucked awkwardly between the slats of his front gate. It wasn't an official notice or a community flyer. It was a photocopied complaint stapled to a generic petition form, the heading in all capital letters screaming, "Neighborhood safety at risk, demand action now." Beneath it were accusations too absurd to ignore, claims that Nathan had installed unauthorized surveillance, that he frequently engaged in suspicious activities, and that his reckless disregard for community norms endangered residents, pets, and children alike. At the bottom, a handful of scrawled signatures clung to the page like an afterthought. None of them belonged to anyone Nathan knew well. He read it twice, standing in the growing heat, before folding it carefully and carrying it inside. There was no shock left in him by now, just a quiet, grinding resolve. Karen had moved into a new phase of her campaign, and the fact that she had managed to collect even a few signatures meant she had succeeded in poisoning at least part of the communal well. Nathan poured himself a second cup of coffee, sat at the kitchen table, and called Julia Black. He read her the contents of the petition, not exaggerating, not editorializing, just laying out the facts. Julia listened in silence before saying, "It's a bluff. She's trying to manufacture the appearance of community support to counter the legal pressure she's feeling. Document it. Don't engage directly with her or with the neighbors who've signed it. We'll handle it through the right channels." Nathan followed that advice to the letter. He scanned the petition, saved digital copies, logged the time and date, and filed everything meticulously. But he couldn't shake the feeling of exposure, the sense that the ground beneath him had turned soft and uncertain. Every friendly wave from a passing neighbor now carried the undertone of suspicion. Every idle glance felt loaded. Karen had weaponized the neighborhood's own quiet conformity against him, making him the outsider, the threat, the aberration in their carefully curated little world. Late that afternoon, as the sun sagged low and baked the sidewalks into pale concrete ovens, Nathan sat behind the wheel of his car, replaying the footage from his dashcam one more time. Not just the footage from the day Karen tried to ram him off the road, but clips from the past few weeks. Karen loitering near his property line, Karen driving slow circles around his house, Karen gesturing wildly at passersby while pointing toward his front door. It was all circumstantial, but woven together it told a clear story. Julia had already compiled the footage into a formal complaint package to be delivered to the district attorney's office, and Nathan was scheduled to give a full sworn statement within the week. That night, the temperature didn't break. The air inside Nathan's house grew heavy and oppressive, sticky against his skin, and sleep proved impossible. Around midnight, he went outside onto his front porch, sitting in the dark with a glass of water balanced on his knee, just breathing in the thick night air. Across the street, Karen's house was lit up like a stage production. Figures moved behind the curtains, doors opened and slammed shut. Raised voices carried thinly across the dead air, sharp and venomous. Nathan watched, silent and still. He wasn't surprised when Karen's golf cart appeared again a few minutes later, coasting slowly past his house, headlights off, tires whispering against the pavement. He watched her without moving, feeling a peculiar, detached sort of curiosity. What exactly was she hoping to achieve at this point? Intimidation? Surveillance? Some kind of manufactured incident she could twist against him? Nathan reached into his pocket, activated the video record function on his phone without raising it, and kept it resting lightly against his thigh, gathering quiet evidence. The next day brought the clearest sign yet that Karen's facade was cracking. Officer Ruiz called Nathan personally. The tone of his voice was different now, less formal, more resolute. He informed Nathan that Karen's behavior, combined with the existing footage and testimonies, now warranted formal charges of reckless endangerment and harassment. The paperwork was being processed, and Karen would soon be summoned. There would be no warning, no polite knock at her door, only a court date and consequences. Nathan hung up the phone and allowed himself a rare moment of satisfaction. It wasn't triumph. There was no joy in watching someone unravel, but it was a grim validation that he hadn't imagined the danger. He hadn't overreacted. He hadn't provoked it. He had simply refused to be another silent casualty of someone else's chaos. Later that evening, while Nathan methodically installed new motion sensor lights along the side of his house, he heard the familiar rumble of Karen's golf cart. It didn't stop this time. It barreled down the street, past his driveway, past the other homes, tires screeching faintly as it took the corner too fast. He didn't need to look to know she was seething. He could feel the rage radiating off her like heat off asphalt. But Nathan wasn't afraid anymore. She was losing control, and that made her dangerous, but it also made her predictable. Nathan finished setting up the last sensor, tested it twice to be sure, and walked back inside, locking the door behind him. His home, once a fragile sanctuary, now felt like a fortress. It wasn't invincible, no place ever truly was, but it was strong enough to withstand whatever storm Karen thought she could summon. He turned off the lights, stood quietly by the window for a moment, and watched as the streetlights flickered against the blackness. Somewhere out there, Karen was still spiraling, but Nathan was no longer within her reach. He had pulled the battle into the daylight where she couldn't hide, and soon the consequences she had spent so long dodging would finally catch up to her. The days following Officer Ruiz's call were a strange mix of tense anticipation and hollow normalcy. Nathan carried on with his routine: work, errands, quiet evenings at home. But everything he did now unfolded under a taut thread of expectancy, like waiting for the first crack of thunder after the flash of distant lightning. For a time it seemed Karen had retreated. Her golf cart disappeared from its usual spot outside her garage. Her blinds remained tightly drawn, and the street itself seemed to breathe easier without her constant, oppressive surveillance. Nathan knew better than to believe it was over. He knew that quiet from someone like Karen didn't mean surrender. It meant regrouping. It was a Tuesday morning, heavy with the humidity that pressed down like wet wool, when Nathan found the next signal of escalation. As he stepped outside to wheel his trash cans to the curb, he immediately noticed that something was off. There, sloppily spray-painted across the side panel of his fence in garish red letters, were the words, "Pervert." The paint dripped down in thick, ugly trails, soaking into the wood grain. For a long moment, Nathan simply stood there, staring at the vandalism, feeling a cold, calculated anger settle into his bones. It wasn't creative. It wasn't even particularly effective. It was desperate. It was the act of someone lashing out blindly because they had lost the upper hand. Without touching the fence, Nathan stepped back inside, retrieved his phone, and methodically photographed every inch of the damage from multiple angles, including wide shots to establish the location. He didn't clean it up. He didn't even call a neighbor to complain. He simply filed the report online with the police, attached the photographic evidence, and included the event in the comprehensive case file Julia Black was building for him. Every insult Karen threw his way, every petty violation, every act of malice. Nathan folded them neatly into the growing legal storm that now had her name printed all over it. Later that afternoon, he returned home to find a bright orange violation notice taped aggressively to his front door. It wasn't from the police. It was from the local Property Management Association. A manufactured complaint alleging that his unapproved fencing alterations violated neighborhood aesthetic standards. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so clearly coordinated. Nathan peeled the notice off carefully and, without ceremony, filed an appeal through the association's dispute system, attaching photos of the untouched fence from before the vandalism, and explaining with measured language that any alterations were the result of criminal activity currently under investigation. He knew Karen had likely submitted the complaint herself, or at least encouraged someone else to do it. It didn't matter. It was another piece of evidence showing a pattern of harassment. But the next incident was harder to ignore. 2 nights later, around 11 p.m., Nathan was jolted awake by the shrill screech of tires on asphalt. He rushed to the window in time to see Karen's golf cart, now sporting what looked like makeshift spotlights duct taped to the roof, blasting down the street at full throttle. As it skidded around the corner, the light swung wildly across lawns and windows, illuminating startled neighbors who emerged onto their porches in confusion and anger. Nathan's new security cameras captured every second of the chaos: the erratic driving, the reckless speed, the near miss with a mailbox. Within minutes, multiple calls had gone out to the police. This time, there were no warnings. Officer Ruiz and his team arrived swiftly, blue lights flashing across the neat rows of suburban homes. Karen's cart was found abandoned 2 streets over, half in a ditch, the front bumper cracked and hanging loose. Karen herself was located shortly after, drunk and furious, weaving barefoot through a neighbor's front yard, shrieking about conspiracies and betrayals. Nathan didn't gloat. He didn't even watch from his window. He stayed inside, calmly sipping a glass of water, while the law finally did what he had patiently been working toward for weeks. The following morning, news of Karen's public meltdown had spread like wildfire. Even the neighbors who had previously avoided choosing sides now found themselves exchanging knowing, wary glances. The woman who had terrorized the street under the guise of neighborhood order had been exposed in the raw light of day for what she truly was. A bully unraveling under the weight of her own malice. But Nathan knew the war wasn't finished just because the tide had turned. Karen's house remained a fortress of sullen defiance, the curtains perpetually drawn, an American flag hanging limp and sun-bleached on her porch. In a final act of venomous pettiness, someone, it didn't take a genius to guess who, sent an anonymous tip to the city inspector alleging that Nathan was operating an unauthorized business out of his home. A code enforcement officer showed up at Nathan's doorstep one humid afternoon, clipboard in hand, asking to conduct a brief inspection. Nathan, ever prepared, greeted him with calm professionalism. He explained the nature of his solar installation business, showed him the permits for his home office setup, and offered copies of his zoning compliance paperwork. The officer, clearly embarrassed by the baseless nature of the complaint, apologized for the inconvenience and left within 10 minutes, leaving Nathan with yet another document confirming that he was fully in the right. Meanwhile, Julia Black moved swiftly and decisively. With Karen's reckless behavior now documented not only through Nathan's evidence but through independent police reports and third-party witness statements, she filed motions for both a restraining order and for damages relating to property vandalism and emotional distress. Officer Ruiz submitted his own report to the court, strongly supporting the issuance of the restraining order based on Karen's escalating dangerous conduct. The final touch came when Nathan received an official court notice informing him that a preliminary hearing had been scheduled. Karen Brooks was being formally charged with reckless endangerment, criminal mischief, harassment, and property damage. She was being summoned to answer for every reckless word, every petty slight, every cruel game she had played. Nathan read the notice once, folded it carefully, and placed it in the growing binder where he kept every piece of this long, ugly war. He didn't celebrate. He didn't crow in victory. He simply stood on his front porch that evening, watching the sun dip low behind the roofs, feeling the first genuine peace he had known since the day he moved in. The battle had been ugly. It wasn't completely over yet. But the hardest part was finished. Now it was simply a matter of time before the law caught up to the chaos Karen had unleashed. And Nathan would be there, patient and ready when it did. The day of the hearing arrived under a heavy, slate-gray sky that seemed to press down on everything in sight. Nathan stood outside the county courthouse, his hands buried deep in the pockets of his jacket, eyes tracking the slow shuffle of cars and pedestrians around the front steps. The building itself was an old brick monolith, its age betrayed by cracks along the stone and windows that rattled in the stiff morning wind. It wasn't the kind of place that inspired confidence or fear. It simply was, a fixture of the town's life, quietly judging the endless parade of disputes, betrayals, and reckoning brought to its doors. Inside, the atmosphere was subdued but tense. Nathan sat near the back of the courtroom, deliberately choosing a seat where he could see everything without feeling like a target. Julia Black sat beside him, a thick folder balanced on her lap, her demeanor calm and impenetrable. Nathan admired her for that. In the weeks they had worked together, she had never once suggested backing down or compromising for the sake of ease. She understood what Karen had done, what she had tried to do, and she treated it with the seriousness it deserved. Karen arrived 10 minutes late, her face a storm of rage and indignation barely masked by an ill-fitting gray suit that clung awkwardly to her bulk. Her attorney, a thin, sharp-eyed man who looked more exhausted than committed, trailed behind her, carrying nothing but a battered leather briefcase. Karen refused to look at Nathan, but he caught the way her fists clenched and unclenched at her sides, the way she muttered to herself under her breath, lips twitching with suppressed venom. It wasn't the performance of an innocent woman wronged. It was the physical manifestation of a pressure cooker about to explode. The judge, a woman in her 60s with short-cropped hair and an air of permanent irritation, wasted no time getting to the heart of the matter. She read the charges aloud in a voice stripped of any emotion. Reckless endangerment, harassment, criminal mischief, property damage. As she spoke, Nathan watched Karen's face carefully. There was no remorse there. No flicker of understanding or regret. Only fury. Tightly coiled. Barely restrained. When it came time for the prosecution to present their evidence, Julia rose smoothly and laid out the case like a surgeon. Dashcam footage, photographs of the vandalism, witness statements from neighbors who had seen Karen's late-night rampages, and the report from Officer Ruiz, documenting her drunken joyride through the streets. Each piece stacked atop the next until it formed an undeniable monument to Karen's campaign of harassment and intimidation. The footage played on a screen mounted near the judge's bench. Nathan forced himself to watch as Karen's golf cart hurtled toward his car, as she prowled past his property like a predator searching for weakness, as her headlights swept wildly over manicured lawns and terrified bystanders. Karen's attorney made a feeble attempt at rebuttal, claiming misunderstandings, overreactions, and neighborly disputes taken out of context. He spoke in the measured tones of someone who knew he had already lost but was obliged to go through the motions. When it was Karen's turn to speak, she couldn't help herself. Ignoring her lawyer's whispered pleas, she surged to her feet, her voice shrill and cracking as she launched into a tirade about how Nathan had provoked her, how he spied on her, how he threatened the safety of their community by refusing to conform. She pointed a shaking finger at Nathan and screamed that he was a liar, a criminal, a pervert. The words tumbling over each other in a froth of incoherent rage. The courtroom, previously silent except for the dry shuffle of papers and the low hum of ventilation, erupted into murmured disbelief. Even the judge allowed a flicker of open disapproval to cross her face before banging the gavel sharply. "Enough, Ms. Brooks," she snapped, her voice cutting through the rising tide of whispers. "Sit down or you will be removed." Karen's lawyer physically tugged her back into her seat, where she collapsed like a deflated balloon, still muttering angrily under her breath. Nathan sat still, his expression impassive, feeling nothing but a deep, quiet vindication. She had finally shown everyone exactly who she was without any help from him. The judge retired briefly to review the submitted materials, before returning with a verdict that felt like a stone dropping through still water. Karen was found guilty on all counts. A restraining order was immediately issued, forbidding her from coming within 100 yards of Nathan or his property. She was ordered to pay restitution for the vandalism, fined for reckless endangerment, and sentenced to community service alongside mandatory anger management counseling. The criminal charges, while not resulting in jail time, would stay on her record indefinitely. A permanent testament to the ugliness she had wrought. As the judge spoke the final words, Karen sagged visibly in her seat, the fight draining out of her in slow, humiliated waves. Nathan didn't gloat. He didn't so much as smile. He simply stood when dismissed, collected his papers with Julia's quiet assistance, and walked calmly out of the courtroom without a backward glance. Outside, the sky had cracked open, releasing a steady, cleansing rain that soaked the sidewalks and painted everything in muted grays and silvers. Nathan tilted his face upward for a moment, feeling the cool drops sting his skin, letting the tension of the past months wash off him like dust. Julia shook his hand firmly before departing, her job done, her part in this war neatly concluded. Nathan walked slowly back to his truck, the court notice folded neatly in his jacket pocket, the weight of it oddly comforting. He wasn't naive enough to believe that the victory would erase all the damage Karen had tried to inflict. Scars lingered, seen and unseen. But he had stood his ground. He had fought back the only way that mattered, with patience, with discipline, with an unshakable refusal to be broken by someone else's madness. And in the end, the truth had prevailed. Life on the street settled into a strange, tentative peace after the trial, as if the entire neighborhood had been holding its collective breath for months, and only now dared to exhale. Karen Brooks remained in her house for a time, the blinds drawn tighter than ever, but there was no mistaking the change. The golf cart sat abandoned under a fraying tarp, its tires slowly deflating. The once proud machine now nothing more than a relic of lost battles and squandered pride. Nathan rarely saw her anymore. Occasionally, there would be a flicker of movement behind her curtains, a glimpse of her heavy silhouette pacing back and forth, but she no longer roamed the street, no longer barked orders at neighbors, no longer attempted to reclaim the authority. She had so thoroughly destroyed in public view. Her isolation was complete, and it deepened with each passing day. The neighbors, too, changed in subtle ways. Those who had once kept their distance now offered cautious nods, sometimes a quick word of thanks when Nathan happened to pass by. He never pushed for conversation. He wasn't looking to be a hero or a martyr. He had defended his home, his right to live without fear, and that was enough. In a community so used to swallowing small injustices to avoid unpleasantness, Nathan's quiet resilience had made an impression far louder than any confrontation ever could. Without ever meaning to, he had reset the tone of the street, proving that it was possible to stand firm without losing dignity. Nathan spent the early fall repairing the damage that had been left behind. He sanded the graffiti from his fence and repainted it a deep, solid color that seemed to anchor the front of his property. He trimmed back the hedges that had been scraped and battered during Karen's desperate charge with her golf cart. He planted new flowers along the walkway, hardy perennials that would survive the winter and come back stronger in the spring. Small, steady acts of restoration that stitched his home back together one quiet afternoon at a time. He didn't think often of Karen anymore. She had become like the fading echo of a storm that had passed. Loud, damaging, but ultimately finite. Sometimes, though, he would hear the faint creak of her front door late at night and wonder if she sat there in the dark, replaying the choices that had led her from self-appointed queen of the neighborhood to its ghost. But he never lingered on those thoughts for long. They weren't his burden to carry. One Saturday, as Nathan was raking the first blanket of fallen leaves from his lawn, a few of the neighbors gathered across the street for an informal cookout. Someone waved him over. For a moment, he hesitated, instinctively wary after so many months of guarded living. But then he set the rake aside, wiped his hands on his jeans, and walked over. The smiles that met him were genuine, if a little awkward. They talked about the weather, the local high school's losing football team, the best places to get coffee in town. Nothing important, nothing heavy. And for Nathan, it was enough. The world hadn't changed. There would always be people like Karen, loud, petty, desperate for control. But there would also always be people like Nathan, quiet, stubborn, unwilling to yield to injustice no matter how small or how personal. That knowledge settled into him like a second skin, a lasting strength that no amount of shouting or vandalism could ever strip away. As the evening light faded into a soft, golden haze and laughter drifted lazily across the street, Nathan realized he had found exactly what he had been looking for all along. Not just a house, not just peace, but a home that he had fought for and won, on his own terms.